Back with us now for the interview is Democratic Senator Kamala Harris of California. She is a newly declared candidate for president in 2020. You are the third U.S. senator to jump into the presidential race. Some other senators may follow. Does that make things weird at work?
I will say that of those who have entered or at least opened exploratory committees and those who are rumored to enter, we all have a great deal of respect for each other and have worked together on many issues and are aligned on many issues. And of course, anyone who wants to should join. And I think it'll be a robust and a healthy conversation. And I have a great deal of respect for my colleagues.
You have only been in the
Truly
Senate
have a great deal of respect.
For 2 years. Why so fast? Why are you willing to move on from this job so fast? You just got there.
November of 2016. And in terms of my background, I have served in local government, I've served in state government, and now in federal government. I understand how these systems work, and I understand how it is not working right now with the current administration and how it is impacting people at every level of our society, much less government. The experience that I've had along the years has been the experience of running an office of 5,000 people, being a part of the executive branch. I know the power of these offices, and I know the harm that they can wreak when they are run in the way that is currently happening. I was raised by a mother in particular who taught us that if you see a problem, you don't complain about it, you do something about it. And when I look at what is going on in our country and the way that, frankly, there is an attack on not only the American dream, but American values, and I know that might sound corny, but it's happening. Each of us has to figure out where we're going to step up and what we're going to do. You know, it's one thing to complain, but I think this is a moment that should require everyone to look in a mirror and ask, what am I doing right now? And what can I do? Here's my perspective. If you want to just take it to a more long term. Years from now, members of our family, our children, our grandchildren, they're going to look at us and they're going to ask us, where were you at that inflection moment? And they're going to want to hear, and I think we're going to want to say something that is more than just how we felt. This is a moment that has to be about what is each of us prepared to do. And Rachel, you've seen this. So many people are answering that question by doing so much. In the United States Senate, in my 2 years there, I have seen thousands of dreamers traveling from around the country, plane, train, bus, coming to the United States Capitol, probably sleeping 10 deep on someone's living room floor. And these dreamers walking the halls of the United States Congress, believing if they are seen and their stories are heard, it will matter. I have seen the same thing with parents, mothers and fathers of children at various stages of disability. Families that it requires great effort to remove the child from one room of the house to another, much less travel across the country to travel the halls of the United States Congress, making sure their stories were heard and their faces were seen. Same with survivors of sexual assault after the Kavanaugh hearing and during. Traveling and having the courage to tell a story they've never told anyone. There is an incredible thing happening in our country right now where there is action and there is a counteraction. And it is a beautiful thing to see, which is so many people understanding we can do better, we deserve better, this is not reflective of who we are. And I will say also that in that fight, it really is an aspirational fight. It is a fight for something, not just against something. It is a fight fundamentally grounded in what I think most people believe, which is we believe in the ideals of our country. You know, we are a country that has always been aspirational. We have these ideals. We were founded on these ideals. Our strength is that we fight for these ideals. And our strength is also that we speak truth and acknowledge we've never quite reached those ideals. We still have a whole lot of problems around issues of equality and freedom and fairness, right? But people are prepared to fight, and I'm prepared to join that fight. And if necessary, and if folks will have me, I'm prepared to help lead that fight.
You have put your past experience in law enforcement as the Attorney General in California and as a prosecutor, as the DA in San Francisco, the elected DA. I remember that election. I remember being amazed to see you come outside from the two establishment candidates and beat them both. And it was a political marvel to see you win that race. I remember watching it from up close. But I also know that you've been buffeted by tough controversies in both of those jobs. When you were the DA in San Francisco, there was a lab tech who was systematically basically messing with evidence.
Oh, yes.
And hundreds of convictions, hundreds of cases were dismissed because of that.
That's right.
When the judge in that lab tech case ruled on what happened, the judge said that prosecutors at the highest level of the DA's office, your office, had to know that there were serious problems at the crime lab, that lab tech was messing with evidence, and that anything she touched essentially was screwing up cases. How did that happen under your leadership without you knowing about it?
So the crime lab was run by the San Francisco Police Department, not by my office. It was run by the police department. There was a technician, to your point, who worked in that crime lab who was basically sniffing what she should have been measuring. And it turned out that hundreds of cases she had handled, and because of her misconduct, I was going to say her taint, but because of what we knew that she did, which was manipulate evidence, you're right. We dismissed those cases.
Hundreds
it was the right, hundreds of them, because it was the right thing to do. When somebody abuses their power, especially in law enforcement, there's going to have to be a consequence.
But did prosecutors working under you know about the concerns about that lab?
The prosecutors,
which is what the judge alleged,
did not know about it. At least said they did not know about it. But the result and the consequence is that cases that prosecutors had worked on were dismissed. Rightly, and it was my responsibility to say those cases will be dismissed because there has been an abuse in the system. And that gets to a wider point. Where we see abuses in the criminal justice system, and in particular by law enforcement, we've got to make sure there's a system in place in this country for consequence and accountability. And at the very least, it's going to have to be about getting rid of those cases, but also reforming the system. And that's what we did after that in terms of making sure that there were steps in place so that at least as the cases came into the DA's office, that we would make sure that there was no taint or no manipulation before it came in.
From another direction, another controversy from when you were DA was in 2004, police officer Isaac Espinoza was killed.
Yeah.
And I know that you at the time were personally opposed to the death penalty. Are you still?
I've been my entire life, and I still am, for very good reasons that I can expand upon.
For full disclosure in asking you the question, I am inclined the same way myself. But as DA, you elected to not seek the death penalty for the person who killed Officer Espinoza.
Right.
And the person who killed the officer, and we don't need to publicize that person because the officer should be remembered, not him.
That's exactly right.
Did get a life sentence.
Yeah.
Was convicted.
That's right.
But when you're running for president now, obviously you know that you have faced questions about that every time you've run for office since then.
I have.
That will put the death penalty on the table as an issue of national debate. The president is an enthusiastic proponent of the death penalty with no qualms whatsoever. You versus Donald Trump on the death penalty would make that a central debate for the country. Would that be constructive or not?
I think it is a debate that we should have. I believe that the death penalty is extremely flawed as a system. I have always been opposed to the death penalty. Back to the point of that case, I'm going to tell you that there were Democrats that said the case should be taken away from me. High-level elected Democrats who said the case should be taken away from me because I would not seek the death penalty. But I did what I believed was the right thing to do, and the killer of that officer will be in jail prison for the rest of his life. On the issue of a national debate, absolutely. Listen, we are talking about a system that creates a final punishment without any requirement that there be DNA to prove it. If there's DNA, it may prove it, but you don't need DNA. It is a system where it has been fundamentally proven to be applied to African-American and Latino men and poor men, disproportionately for the same kind of crime. It is a process where, if you want to talk about deterrence, listen, I have personally prosecuted homicide cases. I specialized for a long time in child sexual assault cases. I have dealt with all kinds of cases that, are not for a PG show. I don't know if your show's PG, by the way. But let me say this. Nobody ever stood there and was about to pull the trigger and then decided, is this going to be life without possibility of parole or the death penalty before they decide to pull the trigger. So the idea that it is a deterrent is also not a strong argument for having in place a system that is fundamentally flawed. So, yes, I am personally opposed to the death penalty. I absolutely believe there should be severe and serious consequence for violent crime, which is why I've prosecuted those cases, and will always seek the highest sentence consistent with the facts of the case. But the death penalty is flawed, and I welcome that debate if it's necessary.
Senator Kamala Harris of California is our guest. She is running for president. We'll be right back with the senator just after this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.